Okay, we've been talking about the oral tradition. Last time we talked at length about the accuracy of transmitting such a large body of information over more than 1,000 years, and I went through that in great detail. There's a question that comes up very often, and I want to deal with that at length because it's an important question in its own right and also touches on other issues. When the rabbis create a law, and they create a law for a purpose, and they tell us, we made this law for this particular purpose, and circumstances change, and the law doesn't serve that purpose anymore, should the law still be binding? Does the tradition regard it as binding? And if so, why does it do so? I'll give you two examples. Now, this may break your hearts, but there's a law that you're not supposed to ride horses on Shabbos. Okay, to make sacrifices for good things. Why shouldn't you ride horses on Shabbos? Well, it was common when you ride a horse to pull down a branch from a tree and use it to guide the horse. As animal rights people would say, no, you're beating the horse and desperately depriving the horse of it and so on. Okay, fine. Not fighting that political battle at the moment. And pulling down a branch from a tree is a biblical prohibition on Shabbos. So don't ride horses lest you pull down a branch. Or medicines for any non-threatening condition where you're just suffering symptoms, medicine is restricted because in those times, medicines were stored as solid blocks of material. You used the medicine by grinding some of the solid block into a powder, and then you ingested it or applied it. And grinding a solid block into a powder is a biblical prohibition. So don't use medicines, again, not when you're in danger. When you're in danger, everything's permissible. Don't use medicines because you may come to grind that solid block into a powder. Obviously today, if someone rides a horse, he has his Christian Dior switch, which is high fashion, to hit the horse with. After all, it's riding a horse, not doing it for transportation. And medicines today are not stored as solid blocks, which we grind into powder. So the question is, since these rabbinic laws were made for a particular purpose, and they no longer serve that purpose, why shouldn't they simply lapse as not relevant anymore and not binding anymore? That's the question. Now, the first thing I'd like to say about this question is that no one in a totally secular context, in a totally pragmatic context, would ask such a question. This question, which parades as the most elementary logic, most obvious logic, no one would ask a question like that in a totally secular, humanist, democratic context. No one would dream of such a question. I'll give you an example. In 1973, there was a war between Israel and its Arab neighbors. And as a result, there was an embargo of oil to the United States. Arab countries stopped shipping oil to the United States. There was a terrible oil shortage, which then led to a gasoline shortage. And there was gasoline rationing. I lived through those days. If you had a license plate number that ended with an odd number, then you got to shop for oil on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And if it was even, it was Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, or it was vice versa. Sundays, everything was closed. Long lines of oil. The price of gasoline went up tremendously. And the United States of America instituted a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. The national law, no traveling more than 55 miles an hour, because your engine runs very efficiently at 55 miles an hour, and as you go higher, the efficiency drops drastically, so you're saving gas by restricting the speed limit. That's a fact, and that went on for, I don't remember how many months it went on before it stopped. It was a year. Now imagine the following scenario. The Arab boycott ends in May. And by the end of June, crude oil is hitting the shores. And by the end of July, new gasoline is at the pumps. And the price has dropped and there's plenty of gasoline available. And in August, George Smith is roaring down the highway at 75 miles an hour. A state trooper pulls him over and says, "Are you nuts? The speed limit is 55 miles an hour. You're doing 75. And George says to the trooper, "Look, officer, you and I know the law was made to protect us against the fact that there was a gasoline shortage. And there was gasoline rationing. And there were very high prices for gasoline. But all that's history. There's plenty of gasoline. The prices have come down. There's no more rationing. So clearly the law doesn't serve its purpose anymore. So the law doesn't serve its purpose anymore. There's no reason to keep it. It's void. It's invalid. It's passé. It's just simply lapsed. And therefore it's perfectly all right to go roaring down the road at 75. What do you think? Is George going to get off? Is that a good defense for now driving at 75? I hope it's obvious to you that that's no defense. That's no defense. The legislature that passed the law will have to decide whether or not to revoke the law. And until the legislature does that, the law is in force. No one can decide, well, the law was made for such and such a purpose and it doesn't serve that purpose, so I'm not bound by the law, that law anymore. No one would dream of such a thing. In a non-religious, non-Khomeini society where we're not dealing with religious fanatics and fundamentalists and so on and so on, no one would dream of such a thing. And by the way, as a matter of historical fact, the United States of America maintained the 55 mile an hour speed limit for the next 20 years. Without an oil embargo, and without rationing, and without gasoline prices through the roof, because they discovered that during that period of time, there was a tremendous drop in deadly accidents and other types of damage, and they kept it in place for 20 years. The bottom line is, no one expects people to make a judgment that a law does or does not serve a purpose, and thereby to decide that the law is no longer in force, no longer valid, and I don't have to keep it anymore. No one thinks that way. So, to ask the question of us as if the Jewish position is weird, odd, illogical, crazy, obviously, off the map, and everybody else would apply that logic elsewhere, no one would apply that logic elsewhere. So the question is not a competent question to start with. That's point one. Are we together with point one? Okay, but now the critic's are going to say, look, the reason why we don't think about laws becoming invalid when they don't serve their purposes anymore is because you chose a clever example. That's what Rabbi said for being clever. You chose an example where the difference took place in August. Now, of course, United States legislatures in August are visiting the China Wall or helicoptering over Alaska or scuba diving in Eilat. Oh, no, they wouldn't go to Eilat. That's not politically correct. But in Europe someplace, the Congress doesn't reconvene until October or November. But when it reconvenes in October, November, they can reconsider the law. And they can decide whether to invalidate the law now that the original condition has changed, or perhaps they have other reasons why they want to continue the law. It's a matter of waiting a few months until that body of legislature can reconsider and give us a new decision. But, Rabbi, we've been waiting 1,600 years because these are laws that were passed by the Sanhedrin, and we haven't had a Sanhedrin for 1,600 years. Isn't that a long time to wait? Shouldn't something be done, let's say after, let's be conservative, 200 years or 300 years. Isn't there a time when you simply call a halt and say, look, it's not living up to its purpose anymore. Somebody ought to do something about it. So now we have to move to stage two. And stage two works like this. We have in the law books a rule. A law that's passed by the Sanhedrin can only be overturned by another Sanhedrin. Just as it is in any normal society. If a legislature passes a law, it's that legislature that has to overturn it, or some super legislature, which sometimes can happen. It's got to be some legal authority that decides to overturn that law. In our case, the Sanhedrin is the highest authority, so it's got to be another Sanhedrin. That's point number one. Now, point number two, we haven't had a Sanhedrin in 1,600 years because we lost the legal conditions under which we could make one. In particular, to sit in the Sanhedrin, you have to be ordained. Ordination was a line down from Moses, generation by generation. Moses ordained 70 people in his time. Anyone with ordination can ordain anybody else. That line was preserved for about 1800 years. The Roman persecutions were the time in which that line ended. Now comes a fundamental philosophical question. How do you look at history? What's going on in history? Is it just people, movements, ideas, ideologies, struggle, war, persecution, freedom, which works out by happenstance one way or another? If that's your view, which is a view, then the fact that we lost ordination and lost the ability to make a Sanhedrin is just because the Romans were successful in the persecution. By the way, they went after ordination particularly because they wanted to break that authority. They wanted to break that institution, and they, so to speak, succeeded. Well, if the Romans destroyed our ability to make a Sanhedrin, and it's a world in which people take responsibility for their own conditions, make another institution. Create another institution and use it to amend the laws or update the laws as conditions change, if that's your view of how history works. But suppose your view of how history works is different. Suppose your view is that the same God who gave the Torah at Sinai and created our legislative system is also running history. He's the one who's determining the outcome of historical events. Then the fact that we lost the Sanhedrin isn't just an accident, a happenstance of history. The same God who made the legal system also created historical events which led to the loss of the Sanhedrin. Now, from our point of view, it's a matter of putting 2 and 2 together and getting 4. Not 3 and not 5, as some would, but 4. God said, if it's a Sanhedrin law, a Sanhedrin is necessary to overturn it. And God took away the Sanhedrin. That's 2 and 2. What's 4? 4 is, God's message is, don't change those laws. It's a direct message from God. I don't want you to change those laws. If I wanted you to have the ability to change those laws, either I would have left you with a Sanhedrin, or I would have created another escape hatch in the legal system, when you don't have a Sanhedrin, another way to change those laws. But since God said it can only be a Sanhedrin that can change those laws, and also took away the Sanhedrin, then God is sending us a message. The message is, I don't want you to change those laws. That being the case, those laws are not changeable. So from our point of view, we are in exactly the same situation as the United States is when a law loses its rationale in August. And where we all recognize the fact that the law lost its rationale in August does not mean that in August you can stop obeying it. The legislature has to reconvene and reconsider and decide whether to revoke the law or not. In our case, it's the same. The Sanhedrin made a law. It requires the Sanhedrin to overturn it. The Sanhedrin has to reconvene, and if God has prevented the Sanhedrin from reconvening, then the message to us is that he doesn't want that law to be changed. That's our reason for the fact that the laws don't change. Questions up to here? Yeah.
The fact that when something new, like let's say the Dud Shemesh or an oven comes into play throughout history, the fact that there's an authority that can set laws according to those things, why can't they have the authority to change the ones that have already been?
Good. That's a very good question. The answer is they don't set laws. I think by choosing that word...
Follow what they say.
No, okay. By choosing that word, I think you're already sensitive to the fact that there's some little fog here. There's something gray here that has to be clarified. They don't set laws. They interpret how the laws apply to this situation. They don't change any laws. They interpret how it applies to this, because, as you say, it's a brand new situation. And when they do that by comparing the situations to which the law applied before and trying to understand exactly how they would apply to this new situation, using the old categories as best they can, subject to discussion and debate and revision and so forth and so on. But that's not a question of making new laws, and certainly not a question of overturning old laws. And this is a subtle business. When electricity was first came into practical use, one of the great decisors asked a scientist to explain to him how electricity works, and the scientist explained it to him wrongly. And he made a decision on the basis of that explanation, and then when others disagreed and they discussed and debated it, they discovered that the explanation that he got was wrong, And of course, he changed his mind right away. When he got the right explanation, he said, oh, of course, then you're obviously right. Which just explained to me in the wrong way. So it's a tricky, difficult situation. But at no point are they making law. They're interpreting and applying law. As, for example, in the United States, the judicial branch is supposed to, though it's philosophically complex and subtle, but the judicial branch is supposed to apply the law that the legislature makes. It's not supposed to create its own law. What we have left now is a judicial function, not a legislative function. Okay, question over here? Oh, good. Now, having said all of this, it is perhaps surprising that there are cases where, when the conditions change, the practice changes. Practice actually does change. But you will, of course, notice that I've changed my vocabulary. I've said now practice changes. I'll give you an example. The Talmud says that certain liquids, if they are left uncovered and unattended, cannot be used later, like water. You have a glass of water, and you're sitting in the room with a glass of water, and suddenly you're called outside, and there's nobody else in the room, and the water is left uncovered. According to the Talmud, you can't use that water. Why not? Because in their habitations, there were snakes and scorpions, and there was the fear that the water could be visited by a snake or a scorpion, which are poisonous creatures, and they could leave behind traces of poison, and it could be dangerous. And therefore, the Talmud says, don't use them. The author of the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, Rabbi Yosef Karo, writes that in our times, now that was his time in 16th century Tzfas, and he says snakes and scorpions are not present in our habitations, and therefore we can drink such water. We're not bound by the Talmud's prohibition. So, at this point, having heard everything I said before, the student says, oh, wait a minute. I thought you said that laws don't change. And even if conditions change, the laws don't change. And here, something's changing. The Talmud says not to use it, and Rabbi Yosef Karo says you can't use it. The answer, for the recording, I'm mentioning this type of going, gives this answer in another context. The answer is this. When you see a rule with a reason, notice I didn't say law, a rule with a reason, do A because B, there might be two different ways in which that rule with a reason is understood. And which way you understand it will determine what happens later when conditions change. One way is do A because A is a law. We made the law A. That's on page 66 of the law book. Now on page 1928, where the footnotes are, you'll get a reason. You know why they made the law to do A? Because of reason B. If that's the way it is, as it is in the cases that I gave you about riding a horse on Shabbos, or not using medicines, if that's the way it is, the law is don't ride horses. The law is don't use medicines. And the reasons are back there on page 1392 about taking branches down from trees or grinding solids into powders. That's not going to change. And even when we don't take branches from trees, we don't grind solids into powders, the laws are fixed and don't change. But there's another possibility. When it says do A because B, it might be understood as follows. B is the law. The law is, B is important. B is a value. Protect B. That's on page 66. The law is protect B. And on page 1392, it says, by the way, in our times and in our circumstances, when you do A, you'll protect B. That's one of the ways to protect B. Then the rule do A is not the law, it's the reason. It's the application of the reason. It's the application of the law. Then when circumstances change, the practice will change. So let's take the case of the uncovered and unattended liquids. There the law is protect your health. Don't take unnecessary chances with your health. That's what's on page 66. Don't take unnecessary chances with your health in any circumstances, under any conditions. And on page 1392 it says, by the way, since we have snakes and scorpions in our habitations, uncovered and unattended liquids can be dangerous, and therefore we're telling you not to use them. But the law is don't take health dangers. Don't take chances with your health. Along comes Joseph Karo, 1,000 years later, and says, by the way, in our circumstances, the law not to take chances with your health, which is absolutely binding and unchangeable, doesn't apply to us because these liquids aren't dangerous. And since the liquids aren't dangerous, there's no reason why we shouldn't drink them. So what we end up with is a consistent policy of never changing the laws, but practice might change because in certain circumstances, the law itself doesn't apply, then the practice can change. Now, I've told you the difference between the two cases in abstract, clear, simple, and precise terms. When you're studying the Talmud, it isn't so easy. They don't come labeled this way, type 1 and type 2. What you have to do is read, in particular, the medieval commentaries, and see how they treated the law, what kinds of objections they considered, what kinds of applications they considered, what kind of reasons they considered, and try to infer what kind of a law it is. And indeed, sometimes there's a disagreement about this. Sometimes the later commentators say, what kind of law is it? Is it a case where the rule of action is the law and the reason is just a support, or where the reason is the law and the rule of action was derived under those circumstances? And by the way, there is some discussion about medicines on that score. Is it that the law was don't take medicine, and the reason was maybe you'll come to grind solids into powders? Or was the law make you sure you don't grind solids into powders? Don't do anything that might lead you to grind solids into powders. Don't do anything related to grinding solids into powders, which would mean today, since we never grind solids into powders for medicine, it wouldn't apply anymore. And there are differences of opinion how lenient you can be with respect to medicine on the basis of question how to analyze the original law, the original practice with this reason, the rule with this reason, where's the legal emphasis on which side. Okay, so that's a guide to this particular question. Are we together so far? Now, there's one other point here that has to be mentioned, and that is when the rabbis say do A because B, they might not be telling us all of the reason or all of the reasons. They might be only telling us one particular reason, which in fact motivated them at the time, but there may be other reasons as well which they didn't share with us. That's already documented in the Talmud. There were times when the rabbis were afraid that if they revealed the reason to the population they were dealing with at that time, the people would not take the reason seriously, and therefore they didn't reveal it. We know that because later the Talmud says, 200 years ago, we made this law, we didn't reveal the reason. But today, when people are more receptive, more understanding, we're revealing it today. It says specifically that at the original time, they didn't reveal the reason. So we have to understand also that when they reveal a reason, it may not be the whole total reason for the law that we have. So then it's going to be very tricky to make a judgment like Rav Yosef Karo did, that the reason of protecting your health was the reason for not using the water. And now that there's no health danger, you can use the water. There are those who disagree with him on those very grounds. That the reason that the Talmud gave wasn't the only reason. There are other reasons as well. And those other reasons still apply today. And therefore we still have to be careful about those liquids today. There are those who disagree with Yosef Karo on that ground specifically. Okay, are we together? Now, part of the reason this is important is because there's a very strong trend of thought championed by Maimonides that in the case of new rabbinic legislation, there's a kind of participatory democracy, direct participatory democracy. I've spoken up until now as if the Sanhedrin makes laws. One of its functions is legislative and it makes laws. According to Maimonides, that's not correct. The Sanhedrin did not have the authority to make laws. Sanhedrin could only propose laws, could only suggest laws. But the law became binding only when the majority of the Jewish population, I'll qualify that in a minute, majority of the Jewish population actually accepts it in practice. When the majority of the Jewish population accepts it in practice, that's when it becomes binding. Before that, not. There was a law that was proposed 3 times. This is Maimonides' analysis. The Talmud mentions it's being proposed by the Sanhedrin 3 times. Why did it take 3 times? Because the first 2 times, the Jewish population didn't accept it. They didn't accept it, they didn't follow it, and therefore it wasn't binding. Only the 3rd time, the majority of the Jewish population accepted it, and then it became binding. So now, whether you tell the reason or not becomes very important. Because if the reason is something which the people can identify with, so then you might tell them the reason because it might encourage them to accept it and live by it. If the reason is something which they're not going to find appealing, you might put it to them blank and say, listen, we're putting it to you and we want you to accept it on the basis of trusting us. That's how we want you to accept it. And either they will or they won't. And if they don't, it's not binding. And only if they do, does it become binding. Now, Maimonides says there's a rule in the Talmud. The phraseology of the rule is a little tricky. Maimonides takes it in a particular way. The phraseology of the rule is this: Ein gozrim gzera al hatzibur elo imkein rov yitzivu yecholin la'amod bo. You don't make a decree for the congregation unless the majority of the congregation can live with it. You might take that as advice. Advice to the legislature. Don't make decrees that people can't live with. What would happen if the legislature broke that advice? Who knows? Maimonides takes it as a binding legal rule. If the majority don't accept it, it's not valid. It just doesn't happen. Means that, at least according to Maimonides, all of the rabbinic legislation is binding only because the majority of the Jewish population accepted it in practice at the time. That's what made it binding. Those people who have a picture of a kind of top-down, tyrannical, rabbinic control of the population have to, I think, modify it to a certain extent because, at least for rabbinic additions to the law, it simply wasn't that way. It had to be ratified in practice, voting with your feet by actually putting it into practice, and that being the case, it became binding and valid. Later, defection from the law isn't going to count. That's just criminal activity. You can't undo that by the majority deciding not to keep the law. That's just criminal activity. And when I say majority of the Jewish population, of course it has to be qualified. People who have checked out of the system altogether don't count. They don't count. It's sort of like having a vote as to changing the rules of a game, like baseball and so forth and so on. I think you wouldn't want people who never go to a game and don't care about it and so forth and so on to vote because they have no interest. They're not connected. You want somebody who has a substantial interest. Maybe he's a member of a league or a member of a support situation, and then you take a poll of those people. You wouldn't take a poll of the people who have no connection to the game. So people who have checked out, their behavior doesn't matter. But people who pledge allegiance to the system and who are living by it and who believe in it, if the majority of them say no, we're not doing this, then it's not binding. So only when a majority say yes and put it into practice. Okay? Okay, now, the decisions that are made by the Sanhedrin is one thing. What about now we don't have a Sanhedrin? Here, there's a split in the situation, which is very important to take account of. Sanhedrin had certain authority, and nothing later without it can have that authority. We just said that. You can't overturn a rule without a Sanhedrin to do it. But the responsibility to follow what your contemporary authorities say carries the same weight as the Sanhedrin. In other words, vis-a-vis the population and its authority vis-a-vis the population, it carries the same weight. Vis-a-vis prior Sanhedrin, it doesn't carry the same weight. There's a rule, there's a verse. You know what? We have it here. Let's look at it. Take out the blue books. Mm-hmm. On page 1027, verse 8, the middle of the page. If a matter of judgment is hidden from you, between blood and blood, verdict and verdict, plague and plague, matters of dispute in your cities. And let me notice that dispute can occur in two different ways. You could have difference of opinion, which are unresolved. Or people can be ambivalent in their own minds. It might just be very hard to arrive at a decision. We're thinking about the issue, and we're talking about the possibilities on both sides, and it's hard to make up your mind in your own mind. There's an internal dispute that you can't settle. Unsettled issues. You shall rise and ascend to the place that Hashem your God shall choose. You shall come to the Kohanim, the Levites, and the judge will be in those days. You shall inquire, and they will tell you the word of the judgment. You shall do according to the word that they will tell you for the place that Hashem will choose. Stop there. It's a pretty clear picture. You're living in Beersheba, you're living in Tiberia, you're living in Tzfas. You have this issue, you can't settle this issue. What should you do? Well, there's a central authority called the Sanhedrin. It's a later term, obviously. And it dwells in a certain place. Send representatives there, put the matter in front of them, and get a decision. And then follow it, because they are the highest authority. Now, we're in the middle of verse 10. That's what we've been told so far. I think as far as the issue that starts in verse 8, we're really finished. Is there any more doubts in your mind? Any questions as to procedure? What you should do? What the outcome is? In the middle of verse 10, you had a problem, you've got a solution. Therefore, in the mind of the reader, the question will be, why does the text go on and on? Let's see if the text adds anything new, adds any clarification, fills in some hole that's missing in the picture. The text goes on from the middle of 10. And you shall be careful to do according to everything that they will teach you. According to the teaching that they will teach you, and according to the judgment they will say to you, shall you do. I don't know about you, but that just sounds like more of the same. It sounds very redundant. Well, our text isn't redundant. It's not just wasting words. It isn't as if the scribe's getting paid by the word. So the more words he writes, the more money he makes. There's got to be some extra content here. And then it follows with a very strong statement. You shall not deviate from the word that they will tell you, right or left. No deviations. Straight and narrow. These extra words, from the middle of 10 to the end of 11, or the middle of 11, these words expand this idea beyond the confines of the previous and expands it in several directions. And according to many, including the Kuzari and Maimonides and the Sefer HaChinuch and the Sefer HaIkarim, four of the great fundamental authorities of the medieval period, this includes every future generation, not just the Sanhedrin, not just that court that sits in the place that God will choose, but the authorities in every future generation have this same authority. Don't turn aside, right or left. So we are not lacking in leadership. We are not lacking in authority. We're lacking in an authority of the stature of a Sanhedrin that could disagree with previous decisions of older Sanhedrins. That we lack. But it's not every man for himself. As it says in the time of the judges, everyone does what's straight in his eyes. That's not the situation. There is still expert rabbinic leadership, and we are as bound to follow them as we were bound to follow the Sanhedrin in its time. Now, if you ask, as many do, but then how do you identify who the leadership is? Who counts as a rabbinic leader? Who counts as this expertise? I think the right answer here is that it's no more difficult than judging expertise in any other area of life. Who are the world's greatest violinists? Who are the world's greatest quarterbacks? Who are the world's greatest physicists? Is this a matter of wide open controversy? Could it be that the quarterback of your local high school team, some people will say, is one of the world's great quarterbacks? Probably not, right? How about the undergraduate quarterback, playing for Wayne State University? He's not going to compare with the ones who run the Super Bowl, right? These are not difficult, subtle, controversial, subjective issues, nor with the world's great violinists, nor the world's great physicists. Yeah, you could have a disagreement. Is he number 3 or number 7 out of the top 10? Yes. But you're not going to have someone who says he's number 7, and someone will say, no, he doesn't belong on the list at all. There are 50 people better than he. You're not going to have that. Because expertise is a matter of judgment based on your own abilities, based on your own stature and your own facility with the field. Your coach who coaches your high school team went to college and majored in sport. He had sports experts who taught him where did they go, who's films do they watch to get inspiration? The films of people who are better than they. There's a hierarchy of expertise, and it traces itself to the top. Yes, 3 or 7, you could have a disagreement, but you're not going to have a gross disagreement about the expertise in any field in the world. The same is true with rabbinics. There are people who are teachers in rabbinical schools, and they went to schools to study, and their teachers themselves have conferences in which they hear lectures from outstanding people, and when there are difficulties to resolve, the question percolates up to the top authorities in the world, and when they give an opinion, then people follow it because they're the top authorities in the world. Their scholarship is open, it's all public, they publish books, they give lectures which are recorded and listened to and discussed and debated, and there's a hierarchy of expertise. So who count as rabbinic experts in the world is a matter that's as objective as it is in any other area of study or practice, any other area of any other discipline. And that being the case, those people who have that authority are the people whom these verses tell us that we have to follow in every generation. Are we together so far? Okay. Now, there is an interesting limitation in this idea, and that's the geographical limitation. Each geographical area has its experts. You're not bound by the experts in another geographical location unless you accept them upon yourselves. When Babylon, after the destruction of the temple, Babylon became the center, and the whole of the Jewish world took its guidance from the court in Babylon because they were the world's greatest experts. Everybody recognized that, and everybody accepted that, but it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be so. Today, you have rabbinic experts in America and rabbinic experts in Israel. Typically, if you're living in Israel, you follow an Israeli expert. If you're living in America, you follow an American expert, unless the American expert will say, I follow the Israeli expert's opinion because I find his opinion convincing, which does happen on occasion, but otherwise, there's no way for an Israeli expert to enforce his authority on America. Each place has its own leadership. But within your area, within your geographical location, if there's a consensus among the authorities, then you're bound by it. If there's a consensus of opinion in the United States, no one can say, yeah, but there's an Israeli rabbi who disagrees, so I follow him. You can't do that. You have no right to import an opinion from a different geographical location. So this authority that the rabbis have is something which is built into the legal system. Are we together so far? Now, even without that, there's an automatic authority that the rabbinic experts have. And it's very simple. The body of Jewish legislation goes back to prophecy. Legislation goes back to Moses. God told Moses, and Moses told us. That means it's revelation. We have the crystallized revelation. Yes, we don't have prophets anymore. Later prophets couldn't create laws anyhow. We have that crystallized revelation. There are people who know that revelation best. And they say, according to the information that we have in that revelation, this is what God wants from us now. Well, that's your best ticket to know what God wants from you now. There's no higher authority than that. They're telling you what God wants from you now. You disagree? Join the debate. Look up the sources, analyze them, check the commentaries, and come up with your own opinion. If you're good, if you've mastered it, if you have something good to say, believe me, you'll be registered as part of the debate. But to read it out of context, to read one paragraph in translation and say, golly, that doesn't appeal to me. Well, you're not part of the experts. I can tell you things about physics and math won't appeal to you either. And you naturally recognize, but you're not trained in physics. You're not trained in math. So you naturally say, people who are trained probably know it better than I do. Exactly the same method works in rabbinics. I've mentioned maybe to a few of you, but here's just a couple of examples which can give you an idea of how absurd things can be in math and physics. Could there be two infinities, one larger than another? Two infinities, one larger than another. To most people, that sounds like gobbledygook, right? But there happens to be a field called transfinite mathematics, and it is demonstrated so. I used to teach it for a living, among other things. And it's a trivial theorem. Georg Cantor proved that in the 1880s, and it's become a standard piece of mathematics. By the way, a cute variation on this is something called Hilbert's Hotel, after David Hilbert, the great mathematician of the early 20th century. Imagine a hotel with an infinity of rooms, and they're all full. Full. So the hotel manager puts up the sign, no vacancies. Car calls up and says, "You got to help me. I'm out of gas, and I have a whole family here, and no place to go. You've got to give me a room." So the manager says, "You saw the no vacancy sign?" He says, "Yeah, I know I saw it, but you got to help me." So the manager says, "Well, you're in luck, because this is Hilbert's Hotel. For people like you, we have an emergency procedure. And for someone like you, we'll put it into effect." Gets on the loudspeaker, and he says over the loudspeaker, "I want everybody to move up one room. Whatever number you're in, move to the room with a number one higher than yours." Okay, what's going to happen? The guy in room 1 is going to move to room 2. The guy in room 2 is going to move to room 3. The guy in room 46 is going to move to room 47. The guy in room 263 is going to move to room 264. Are we going to run out of rooms? There's an infinity of rooms, right? The guy in room 1971 is going to move into room 1972. Everybody's going to have somewhere to go. And now room 1 is empty. And this poor, unfortunate family can move into room 1. That's Hilbert's Hotel, right? It's never really full beyond adjustment. It may be full because every room has somebody in it, but there's always room to make room. There's always a way to make room for somebody else, right? Weird, hey? That's the way infinity works. It's just weird. Now, if that doesn't resonate with you, of course you say, well, there are people with PhDs in the subject. There are textbooks in the subject. Probably there's an explanation somewhere. And if I learned it, I'd probably understand it too. I just don't understand it yet. Quite right. That's quite right. As I know from the experience of teaching it, that people do come to understand it after a while. In physics, there are cases where at least some great physicists like Richard Feynman and John Wheeler say that you have cause and effect, where the effect comes first and the cause comes afterwards. Now, I don't know. Intuitively, my mind does boggle at that. If the effect happens, don't all the causes have to be there? The ones that made it happen? Don't they have to be there first to make it happen? How could it be if there's a cause and it didn't take place yet, that the effect is happening already? How did that? But that's what they say. There are things that move backwards in time, and the effect can happen before the cause. Okay, but Richard Feynman had a Nobel Prize in physics. He wasn't dumb. There's probably some thought behind it, even if I don't grasp it. Now, we give that kind of leeway to math and physics because we say, well, those guys are very smart, and they're very careful, and they usually have things to say, and even if I don't understand it, well, I suggest to you that rabbinics is the same way. If they say something, and it seems very peculiar to me, very odd to me, almost paradoxical to me, but I know I haven't studied it the way they have, and I'm probably not as smart as they are, then I'm going to give them the same leeway that I would give to math and physics. Yeah, there's probably some logic to it, even if I don't understand it. And that applies not only to the official Sanhedrin, because these verses apply to later generations, they apply to later generations as well. Here's a practical example, which some of you may be familiar with, at least the practice, though you may not know the statement. The Talmud says that when you step back from the silent prayer, you must bow first to the right, and then to the left, and then straight forward. First to the right, then to the left, and then straight forward. And indeed, there are people, sorry for the camera, there are people who come back like this and bow right, left, and forward. But there are other people who bow like this side, and that, and then forward. What are they doing? What are they doing, those second group? Doesn't the Talmud say you have to bow right, left, and forward? What are they doing? Answer, they're bowing to his right. Not to my right, but to his right. When I'm praying, I'm facing, so to speak, God. Now listen again to the statement of the Talmud. It said bow to the right. and then to the left. It didn't say bow to your right and to your left. It said the right and the left. And you could have asked, who's right? Which right? And that would have been a good question. Just didn't think of it. And then it comes out that one says the right means your right, and they go this way. And one says the right means his right, and then you go this way, because that's his right, because he's facing me. And both are right. Both are correct. So something which seemed obviously nuts. How can you say going this way is right? All of a sudden, with a little explanation, it becomes quite easy, quite natural. So that's the kind of leeway that one should have for the rabbinic authorities. They know what they're doing. They're winners in an open scholarly competition. The only thing that puts them on the top is scholarly competition. People say, well, I compare his explanation with his explanation, his proof with his proof, and his proofs are better. And they're more extensive. He has much wider grasp. He does this all the time in many, many different areas. Well, then, when it comes to something I don't understand, he's earned credibility. You know, the word authority is ambiguous. Your state legislature has authority. Police captain has authority. What about a world-famous mathematician? He has authority in another sense. He has scholarly authority. He's mastered the field. So what he says is taken seriously because he's an authority on the field. That's not legal. Nobody voted him in. There are no laws that give him that. He just knows the field very well. Our authorities know the field very well. They know it backwards and forwards. I gave you some examples. In fact, I think we left off doing that, and we should do it again. Examples where the rabbis say things, and you look at the verse, you look at what they said, and there doesn't seem to be much connection there. And then, when you go through some analysis of it, you find that it's based on exquisite logic and exquisite analysis. It just takes time to get there and to see it. We have about 10 minutes. Let me give you a case, and with that, I'll finish today. The famous story of Cain and Abel. There are two things I want to show you here. Start in verse 8. This is toward the end. There's a small thing I want to show you, and that's a little more complicated at the beginning. Cain spoke with his brother Abel. It happened in the field. Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Shem said to Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" He said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" That famous, brutal, cruel dissociation. My brother means nothing to me. Now, suppose someone says, "Well, look, what kind of picture of God is this text giving me? God is asking Cain where Abel is. I thought Judaism believed in an omniscient God. God knows everything. He's got to ask one second. He's got to ask where Abel is." Obviously, the primitive Hebrews, before the official theology got set, had a much more primitive picture of God in the sky, a grandfather who's maybe, losing his memory and doting and so forth and so on. And he has to ask because, and they had a much more humanistic picture of God. And then later on, when Isaiah created his exalted poetry and everything else, he cleaned things up and made things more sophisticated and so forth and so on. After all, isn't God asking Cain where Abel is? Well, no. Look at the next verse. God says to him, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." Does God know what Cain did? You bet. It says so right there. So what was going on in the previous verse? Why was he asking him? As the rabbinic tradition says, to enter into conversation with him, to get him to think it over. Maybe he'll realize what he's done. Maybe he'll come to a realization and think, but where is he? Where is he, my brother? Where is he? What did I do? God is trying to spur him into some kind of thought. So if you read verse 9 without verse 10, and believe me, the critics do exactly that. If you read verse 9 without verse 10, then you can come to a gross misunderstanding of the biblical picture of God. When Adam eats from the tree and he hides, and they say, "Oh my goodness gracious, how can he hide? Doesn't he know God knows everything?" And God goes along with it, and God says, "Where are you?" Right? They say, well, okay, so they believe in a limited God. You can hide behind bushes and God won't know where you are. It's ridiculous. Turn over the page and read this, and you see you can't do that. So again, the purpose is to enter into discussion with him. But if you don't read this, if you read just the story in the Garden of Eden, and you don't know the rest of the text, then you think the rabbis are just making it up, or the rabbis are teaching me social forms or educational forms. The verse is absolutely explicit here. Okay, but let's take a look at something else. How did they get into this problem? Top of the page. After a period of time, Cain brought an offering to Hashem of the fruit of the ground. Abel brought, I'm changing the translation to make it more literal, of the first name of his flock, the choicest. Hashem turned to Abel his offering and accepted it. It's implied in the Hebrew. Cain, his offering, did not turn, did not accept. This annoyed Cain exceedingly. So speak our friends from London. In plain Hebrew it is, he was outraged. He was exceedingly annoyed. And his countenance fell, he was depressed. Shem said to Cain, why are you outraged? Why is your countenance fallen? Surely, if you improve yourself, you'll be forgiven. If you do not improve yourself, sin rests at the opening, not door, but opening. Its desires toward you, and yet you can conquer it. Rashi says, it rests at the door of your grave, your sin is preserved. The opening of your grave, the sin is preserved. Opening of your grave. The reader says, what? Rashi, where are you coming from? What are you talking about? Who's talking about graves here? Who's talking about dying here? There's nothing in the text that leads to that. Nothing in the text that hints at that. Where are you coming from? Now watch. A little piece of logical analysis. Again, if you improve yourself, you'll be forgiven. If you do not improve yourself, what ought to come now? If you improve yourself, you'll be forgiven. And if you don't improve yourself, then you won't be forgiven. If A, then B. If not A, then not B. What you get here is, if A, then B. If not A, Q. If you improve yourself, you'll be forgiven. If you don't improve yourself, then sin rests at the opening. The reader ought to say, what happened? You're setting up a logical structure, and at the last minute, you're breaking it. Why are you doing that? That's one question. Second question. If you improve, you'll be forgiven. If you improve, when? By next Tuesday? By 4 o'clock? Next month? Beginning of the year? Up until when do you have to improve? Answer, your whole life. Your whole life. There's no limit. No statute of limitations on improving. You can repair anything. If you repair it before you die, it's repaired. So the text says, if you improve while you're still alive, you'll be forgiven. And if you don't improve while you're still alive, then you might think, I made it. I escaped it. I lived my life, and I died, and everything went fine. No, you won't escape it. The sin is waiting for you at the opening of your grave, and you'll be punished after death. You won't be forgiven. You'll still be held accountable. What Rashi's words do is restore the logical balance to the sentence. If you improve, you'll be forgiven. And if you don't improve, you won't be forgiven. Meaning, if you don't improve in the time that you have to improve, which is your whole life, then after death, you'll be paid. So Rashi is answering the question, what happened to the logical structure of the sentence? He's restoring the logical structure of the sentence. Rashi's not coming out from left field. He's not disconnected from the verse. A logical analysis of the verse makes Rashi's comment gold. I'm not saying it's the only way the verse could be understood. Rashi's comment isn't just bizarre, just coming out of left field. Rashi's solving a direct problem in the verse. His comment solves it directly. And by the way, that's why it's important to translate opening and not door. The word for door in Hebrew is deles. The word here in the text is pesach. Pesach means opening. Be the opening of a jar also. Grave has an opening. Doesn't naturally have a door, but it has an opening. You make it the opening of your grave, you restored the balance of the sentence. Now, if you go through several hundred of those, you will come to respect the rabbis. They're not fooling around. And they're not just saying things make you better people, which is not a bad thing to do. Also, when they make comments on verses, the comments are based on logic. They're based on logic and analysis. You just have to work a long time because they don't tell you. They just make the comment. They expect you to figure out where it came from. The commentators on the commentators do that. Rashi's commentary has over 100 super commentaries. And that's what they do. They analyze the background, analyze the logic, explain to you where Rashi's coming from. Rashi and the rabbis generally are not coming from nowhere. They're always coming on the basis of some kind of logic. Okay.